Welcome back to Season 2 of the Philosophemes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalabrino. I'm proud to be part of the Evergreen Podcast Network, and thank you for being here. All right, so I thought I would kick off Season 2 with a philosophy and true crime episode. So this is Philosophy and True Crime 2. We're looking at the Luigi Mangione case. So as always, please remember that we're not doing cultural politics or religion on this podcast. I do not advocate for gun violence or the harming of innocent people. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal, medical, or any other kind of advice. I'm not recommending or encouraging that you do anything or that anyone do anything. Also, I have no personal connection to anyone involved with Luigi Mangione or Brian Thompson. Our thoughts and prayers go out to everyone affected. As a quick recap, Luigi Mangione is an Italian-American who was identified as the suspect in the killing of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare. And this happened on December 4th of 2004 in New York City. There was a nationwide manhunt, and Mangione was arrested and arraigned in Pennsylvania 5 days after the shooting. He appeared in a federal court in New York City, and he pled not guilty to his state charges. He has been indicted on 11 state charges and faces 4 federal charges, including first-degree murder, murder in furtherance of terrorism, criminal possession of a weapon, and stalking. So the federal murder by firearm charge makes him eligible for the death penalty, although I am unaware whether federal prosecutors will pursue it. Specifically, we're looking at Mangione's alleged actions through the lens of one of history's most recognizable thinkers, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher and attorney from the 17th century. Of all the theories of natural justice, Hobbes's is perhaps the most recognizable. It's standardly taught in all undergraduate philosophy programs. It, of course, involves 2 key concepts: the state of nature and sovereignty. Put generally into the form of a question, we might say, could Hobbes's ideas on the state of nature and sovereignty offer an interesting perspective regarding the questions of morality and natural justice surrounding the case of Luigi Mangione? All right, I've divided the podcast into 8 sections. I'll list them here and try to remember to mention each time we enter a new section. And the reason for doing this is to keep everything that could be said to a manageable amount. So after setting the stage in the first section, we might call the first section the state of nature. And the second section, we might call it the sovereign's responsibility. The third section, diffidence and self-preservation. The fourth section, implications for justice. The fifth section, the question of terrorism. And then the remaining questions deal really with some documentaries that I've encountered regarding Mangione. So Section 7 would be called the insanity defense, and Section 8 would be just doing his job, quote unquote, historical parallels. And then we will wrap this whole thing up. All right.
We off?
30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
10 years from today, Lisa Schneider will trade in her office job to become the leader of a pack of dogs. As the owner of her own dog rescue, that is. A second act made possible by the reskilling courses Lisa's taking now with AARP to help make sure her income lives as long as she does. And she can finally run with the big dogs. And the small dogs, who just think they're big dogs. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/skills.
So we might start with a key question, and that is, what is Hobbes' state of nature, and how does it relate to justice? I actually wrestled with what to call this episode. I considered the title, How to Argue Mangione is Not a Murderer, and I also considered the title, Mangione, Corporate Sovereignty and the State of War. Ultimately, I chose Mangione and the Philosophy of Natural Justice because I think it strikes a good balance. Okay, so in order to understand Hobbes' philosophy of natural justice, we'll first need to get a grip on his most famous idea, that is, the state of nature. Hobbes presented this idea in his 1651 groundbreaking work, Leviathan. Hobbes believed that without a common authority, that is, a sovereign, to enforce laws, humanity would exist in what he called a state of nature. In this state, life is, as Hobbes infamously put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But why? Why would the state of nature be those things? The state of nature is a condition where no overarching power exists to enforce order or security. Individuals act purely out of self-preservation, and justice and injustice, as Hobbes argued, do not exist without a common power to define and enforce them. So here's the twist that is relevant to our discussion. Hobbes argues that actions in the state of nature, even killing, can't be called murder because the framework for laws and justice simply don't exist. Justice, according to Hobbes, only comes into being when individuals agree to a social contract, ceding certain freedoms to a sovereign in exchange for protection. In other words, making an exchange with the sovereign for insurance regarding the future. According to Hobbes, the state of nature is naturally a state of war in which, quote, it's every man for himself, end quote. Every person out for their own self-preservation. Thus, in the state of nature, everyone is naturally in conflict, a, quote, war of all against all. This is because in the state of nature, everyone has the natural right to everything. This means something like, if you have the might or the power to take it, then it'll be yours. So what about justice? Without a common power to enforce agreements, Hobbes tells us there can be no concepts of right or wrong. Justice requires laws which are absent in the state of nature or in the natural state. Force and fraud in this environment become virtues of survival. It's a grim perspective, but one that underscores the importance of the sovereign. To escape the chaos of the state of nature, Hobbes suggests people band together and establish a sovereign authority. On the one hand, there's a Nietzschean element here because it would be the weak who band together against the stronger ones who are overpowering them. So the weak ones surrender their natural right to everything, and by surrendering personal liberties to a common authority, they gain peace and protection. The sovereign, as Hobbes describes it, acts as a mortal god who ensures mutual security through centralized power. The sovereign, then, is a central authority to whom the people willingly subject themselves through what Hobbes called a social contract. Thus, we have a sovereign and the sovereign's subjects. On the other hand, there's a huge rabbit hole here that we could go down, discussing how subjectivity depends on one's relation to the state of nature. It's a super interesting topic in my opinion, but we're going to have to table it for now. Okay, so on to Section 2, the sovereign's responsibility. And the key question for Section 2 might be something like this. What happens when the sovereign fails to protect its people? For Hobbes, the sovereign's primary duty is to ensure the safety and security of its subjects. This is the cornerstone of the social contract. But what happens if the sovereign fails, or worse, actively threatens the lives of its people, of its subjects? Hobbes tells us that when the sovereign fails to protect, the social contract dissolves, and individuals find themselves again in the state of nature. So, to be clear, sovereignty is the absolute authority individuals collectively establish to maintain order and peace. It must remain indivisible and supreme to be effective, and the sovereign's legitimacy depends on its ability to protect its subjects, right? Because the state of nature is a state of war. All right, so if we are going to apply Hobbes's theory of natural justice to the Luigi Mangione case, then we'll need to link Hobbes's ideas to their respective aspects in the case. Following this logic, the sovereign in the Mangione case wasn't a king or government, but a corporation. If we were to make that connection, then we might go further to say this corporation, allegedly denying life-saving healthcare, thrust vulnerable individuals into what Hobbes may have considered a state of nature. We're going to characterize this in a slightly different way in just a moment, but to establish the initial foundation, the idea is something like insurance companies function as a kind of sovereign. Just as a subject relinquishes its natural rights for insurance from the sovereign, when the sovereign refuses to make good on the sovereign's contract to protect, then the subject finds itself in the state of nature with the sovereign. From this point of view, it would make sense to suggest that the sovereign may consider their former subject a quote-unquote terrorist. Because as soon as the sovereign no longer abides by the contract, then the former subject and the sovereign are in a state of nature, and the state of nature is a state of war. Does the failure of a sovereign corporation to protect its subjects justify Mangione's alleged actions as a defense of those abandoned by the social contract? In order to answer this question, we will move on to Section 3 and discuss Hobbes's thoughts regarding diffidence and self-preservation. Okay, so Section 3, diffidence and self-preservation. Diffidence means mutual distrust, and it's not a common term. It's spelled D-I-F-F-I-D-E-N-C-E, diffidence. So the key question for this section would be, how does Hobbes's concept of diffidence apply to vigilante motivations? Hobbes introduces the idea of diffidence or mutual distrust as a key driver of human behavior in the state of nature. When individuals feel insecure, they preemptively act, and sometimes that's even violently, to ensure their own safety. Mangione's alleged actions can be seen through this lens. If we put it in the form of a question, we might ask, Was he acting out of fear or mistrust toward a corporate system that he believed had failed to protect him and others? Just to make sure we're clear on diffidence, diffidence refers to the fear or mistrust that individuals feel toward others in a lawless environment, a state of nature. It leads to preemptive actions to secure safety, and in Hobbes' view, this is a rational response to uncertainty in the state of nature. That's why it's considered naturally just. This brings us to a key philosophical question regarding natural justice. Supposing Mangione did perform the actions in question, if those actions were motivated by a rational need to protect life, would that make him less culpable according to Hobbes' framework? Okay, so section 4 gives the answer to that question, and the answer to that question seems to necessarily be yes. So in order to fully understand this question, though, we would need to say yes for 2 reasons with 1 qualification. All right, so section 4, implications for justice. As a key question for this section, we might ask, what are the implications of Hobbes' philosophy for justice in Mangione's case? Well, if there's no such thing as murder in the state of nature, what does that mean for how Hobbes would judge Mangione's alleged actions? Hobbes tells us that justice depends on the sovereign's ability to provide order and security. When the sovereign fails, individuals revert to natural rights, including self-preservation and arguably the defense of others. So here's the critical point. If Mangione saw himself as defending those thrust into a state of nature by the sovereign's failure, then his alleged actions might be framed not as a crime, but as a form of natural justice. I thought this worth presenting because it fundamentally challenges the framework of corporate accountability and raises profound questions about the relationship between power, justice, and survival. So it seems Hobbes would say yes, a vigilante character's attack on a corporate sovereign would be less culpable for 2 reasons. 1, the vigilante character would be in the state of nature in relation to the sovereign, and in the state of nature there is no law restraining individuals from killing. 2, preemptive action and self-preservation characterize natural justice in the mutual state of distrust that is the state of nature, which is why it is a state of war. So those actions taken in the state of nature would be considered naturally just. I think this is why there is so much consternation and confusion revolving around what happened. Section 5, the question of terrorism. So the question of terrorism would be the qualification. I mentioned that according to Hobbes, it is possible to see a vigilante's actions as just in terms of natural justice. And we noted that there would need to be 1 qualification. So what is that qualification? The qualification is that when you are no longer protected by the social contract, then you are an enemy of the sovereign. You are an enemy of the state. Specifically in this case, you might say that when an individual enters into a state of nature with a sovereign corporation, and the corporation still has a social contract with the highest state sovereign, then the individual finds themselves also in the state of nature with the highest state sovereign. But I think we would need to finesse this a little. For example, did the former corporate subject appeal to the highest state sovereign for protection? And did the highest state sovereign side with the corporation rather than with their subject? Certainly, though, if it is the case that the former corporate subject finds itself in the state of nature relation to the highest state sovereign, then that former subject may rightfully be called an enemy of the state, that is, a terrorist. Yet there is one other angle here to consider from within Hobbes' philosophy. For example, Hobbes might argue that in the absence of a functioning sovereign, labels such as rebel or terrorist might lose their meaning, leaving us to consider whether the vigilante's actions are better understood as natural justice in response to systemic failure, rather than a simple enemy of the state. Remember, Hobbes notes that when a sovereign fails to protect its people, individuals are justified in defending themselves and others. If Mangione's alleged actions are seen as a defense of those abandoned by the corporate sovereign, he may fall within Hobbes' natural rights framework. Hobbes might say that the line between justice and terrorism becomes blurred when sovereign power fails to uphold its contractual duty. Another interesting question we might ask then is, to what extent does calling a vigilante a terrorist mean that the corporation in question is a kind of sovereign? It could simply be the case that the highest state sovereign will not condone violence. However, those thrust into the state of nature certainly seem to consider that thrust itself to be a form of violence. Is corporate violence state-sanctioned violence? Disputes that are not against the sovereign are not terroristic disputes. So you can see this shines an interesting light. In Hobbes' text, there is evidence to suggest that defending others thrust into the state of nature by the sovereign can align with natural rights. We may refer to this evidence under three titles. 1, the sovereign's obligation to protection. 2, justification of defense in extremis. And 3, defending the vulnerable in a broken commonwealth. Regarding the first, Hobbes emphasizes that the obligation of subjects to the sovereign lasts only as long as the sovereign provides protection. When protection fails, individuals are released from their covenant and return to the natural condition, where self-preservation becomes paramount. Regarding the second, justification of defense in extremis, Hobbes allows that individuals, even guilty ones, may justly defend their lives when faced with death or existential threat. When individuals band together for mutual defense in response to sovereign failure, this is not necessarily unjust, as it is driven by the fundamental natural right to self-preservation. Regarding the third, defending the vulnerable in a broken commonwealth, if the sovereign's actions thrust certain individuals into a state of nature, defending them could be interpreted as an extension of the natural right to preserve life. I'm thinking about parents and their children, for example. Hobbes notes that when a sovereign relinquishes power or fails to uphold the covenant, individuals may seek protection wherever they find it and are justified in doing so. In the context of Luigi Mangione, the analogy suggests that if the sovereign, a corporation or authority, fails to protect the vulnerable, for example by denying essential health care, it has effectively dissolved the social contract for those individuals. Mangione's alleged actions might then be framed as defending those placed into a state of nature, which is a permissible and just act within Hobbesian logic.
¿Dónde están los $5 millones que me robaste?
Gloria tendrá que encontrar el dinero. Su vida y la de su hijo dependen de ello.
Hay que acorralar a la viuda.
¡Tengo mucho miedo, mamá!
El peor de los caminos será el único posible.
A mí no me importa ir a la cárcel con tal de salvar a mi hijo.
En la nueva superserie de Telemundo.
Esta mujer es clave. Que empiece la cacería.
La Jefa. Martes 18 de febrero a las 10:09 Centro por Telemundo.
Okay, then just 3 more points to consider as we wrap this up. After watching a number of documentaries on Mangione's case, I felt as though the commentary could use a little more philosophical finesse. specifically the following 3 issues and questions that were raised in the documentaries. Each one has its own respective section as we conclude this episode. So, Section 6, alleged contradictions on gun violence. So the key question here is there a contradiction in opposing gun violence but defending Mangione's alleged actions? A documentary on Mangione's case raises an interesting question. Is it contradictory to oppose gun violence in general while defending Mangione's alleged actions? At first glance, this tension might seem like a moral inconsistency, but let's explore it through Hobbes's framework. Hobbes would argue that the context here is everything. In the state of nature, actions that might otherwise be seen as violent or unjust are reframed as rational responses to the lack of security and protection. Mangione's alleged actions could be interpreted as an act of self-preservation or even defense of the vulnerable, as noted previously, given the sovereign's failure to uphold its responsibilities. So, is there a contradiction? And the answer seems to be not necessarily. Hobbes challenges us to consider how morality shifts in different contexts. While gun violence in a well-ordered society may be rightly condemned, Mangione's alleged actions took place in what could be considered a state of war, a context Hobbes would argue is fundamentally different. This lens helps us navigate the apparent contradiction by grounding our understanding in the circumstances surrounding the act. It's not a blanket defense, but an invitation to consider the complexity of justice in a fractured system. Section 7, the insanity defense. So the key question for this section might be, how does sanity function as a social construct within Hobbes's framework? A documentary on Mangione's case suggests his best defense is pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. But what if we think of sanity itself as a social construct? In Hobbes's terms, sanity depends on the social contract. Without the structure of a commonwealth to define norms and deviance, who gets to say what is sane? So in a state of nature, the concept of sanity might collapse entirely, leaving only survival and self-preservation as guiding principles. So again, we see that within Hobbes's framework, the context of the state of nature may seem that the insanity defense wouldn't work, or that the insanity defense wouldn't be the best framework. At the same time, you might go so far as to say that, is it insane to want to be in the state of nature with the sovereign? I think that Hobbes's answer to that is no, it is rational if the sovereign has abandoned their duty to protect. All right. Lastly, then, Section 8. So this also came up in a documentary about the Mangione case, and the quote was, "just doing his job." So the question might be, what does Hobbes's philosophy say about institutional complicity? And this is really focusing more on the United Healthcare side of this equation rather than on Mangione's alleged actions. So let's consider a defense offered for the healthcare CEO in one of these documentaries. I think there was one documentary was TMZ and the other documentary was 2020. And so in defending the healthcare CEO, this gentleman stated, quote, "he was just doing his job," end quote. So this is in response to the protesters who were suggesting that United Healthcare had thrust people into a state of nature relation to them. And by being in a state of nature relation to United Healthcare, they were in a state of nature relation to Brian Thompson, the CEO. So interestingly, as soon as I heard that phrase, it rang the bell for me. It echoes a chilling historical defense that was used by certain Nazis during the Nuremberg trials. Adolf Eichmann, for instance, famously claimed he was simply following orders. And so the comparison here is provocative, right? Can we excuse actions that contribute to systemic harm simply because they align with institutional roles? Hobbes's emphasis on the sovereign's duty to protect might suggest otherwise. So fascism versus the people is corporate rule versus the folk. Whose rules do we follow? Human rules like natural justice, or whatever rules the sovereign entity imposes? But when the sovereign entity puts profit before the people, well, then the historical scene is set for George Washington. So in this episode, we've explored Hobbes's philosophy, and we've considered how it offers a powerful lens to examine the Luigi Mangione case. From the state of nature to the role of the sovereign, Hobbes's ideas challenge us to think critically about justice, morality, and authority in contexts where the social contract breaks down. But before we end this episode, I'd like to recommend a fantastic book for anyone looking to deepen their understanding of Hobbes's philosophy. The book is titled Submission and Subjection in Leviathan: Good Subjects in the Hobbesian Commonwealth. It's written by Professor Dr. Michael Byron. It's a thought-provoking read and a perfect companion to this discussion. So to close here, I'd like to leave you with a question or two. Ultimately, what do you think? Can Hobbes's ideas on the state of nature and sovereignty help us make sense of modern dilemmas like the Mangione case? Or do these 17th century ideas fall short in today's world? Let me know your thoughts. You can stop over to YouTube and drop a comment. I hope you found this thought-provoking. And again, our thoughts and prayers go out to everyone affected. I'm hoping that this does add some philosophical finesse to the commentaries and the documentaries that are out there, because as I noted, it may not be as straightforward as some of these documentaries are attempting to present it. And also, they are presenting as puzzled about some of these issues that philosophically, in the context of Hobbes's philosophy, for example, don't seem so puzzling.
Ooh.